Hi class, in this video we are starting our section on stress, and this is, I think, one of the most important chapters in the book because this is one that can be really relevant to your everyday lives, since y'all have stress and you might not necessarily know the best ways to handle stress, to decrease your stress. And so hopefully by the end of this chapter, you have some ideas on things you can do if stress is an issue for you. First, let's talk about the definition for stress. There are a couple of ways to define stress. One of the original ways was thinking about it as stimulus-based, which is when you conceptualize stress as a demanding or threatening event or situation. So stress is a stimulus that causes certain reactions. Again, I said this is kind of one of the original ways to talk about it. You don't necessarily see a lot of people using this description now because it's a little bit problematic. It doesn't recognize that people differ in how they view and react to challenging life events or situations. For example, when we talk about the SRRS that measures stressful events and the likelihood it will lead to significant illness or accident, one of the things that is high up on the list is if you move. I love moving. I move every few years. I moved to Mexico because it sounded fun, and for my husband's job, not just for fun. But moving isn't stressful for me. Whereas, and I've moved, oh gosh, 25 times in 40 years. I move a lot. It's what I've known my whole life. But if you were born in a house and lived there until you went to college, moving to college is probably a whole lot more stressful for you. Your first move into your first apartment, especially if it's not near your parents who are still in that house you were raised in, that's going to be really stressful for you potentially. You might handle moving differently than I do because it means something different for you than it does for me. So the stress-based or the stimulus-based definition ignores that perceptual element to it. The response-based idea says that it conceptualizes stress in ways that emphasize the psychological responses that occur when faced with demanding or threatening situations. So stress is a response to environmental conditions. When we talk about Hans Selye later on, his definition of stress is response-based because it sees stress in terms of the body's physiological reaction to the demand that's placed on it. So you are responding to what is going on. The definition we are going to use for this chapter is that stress is a process whereby an individual perceives and responds to events that should say they, appraise as overwhelming or threatening to their well-being. I'm going to change that. So this version emphasizes the importance of how you appraise that demanding or threatening event, what we call stressors. These appraisals influence how you're going to react, how you're going to respond to the event. So again, stressors are these demanding or threatening events. The appraisal of the stressor influences your reaction. There are two types of appraisals you can make: primary, and then potentially you'll make a secondary appraisal. I'm going to move up here. For a primary appraisal, everyone's going to make a primary appraisal when something demanding happens. This is when you decide the degree of the potential harm or threat to your well-being that the stressor might entail. So how big of an issue is this thing? How big of a deal is this thing? Is it a threat or is it a challenge? If it's appraised as a challenge, then which means that, you know, this is an opportunity for growth. Like, it might be hard, but you could get a lot out of it at the end. That is challenge. Then it's not going to lead to stress. So if that primary appraisal says this is a challenge, this could end up being a good thing, it's just going to be hard, you're all good. If you appraise it as a threat, in the primary appraisal, if you appraise this as a threat, which means that it could lead to some kind of harm to you or some kind of loss, then you will make the secondary appraisal. So if it's appraised as a threat in the primary appraisal, then you move to the secondary. And this is when you think about the options you have to cope with the stressor, as well as how effective those options can be. So if it's a threat, and you have lots of support, like this could be bad, but you have lots of people around you, then you'll be okay. You won't be as stressed out. If it's a threat and you don't have the resources to deal with these demands that are going to put on you, that is when you are going to experience significant stress. So first level, is it a threat or a challenge? Secondary appraisal, if it's a threat, do I have the resources to meet it? If no, that's how you get the stress. And again, just along with the lines of our definition for stress, it's all about your appraisal of it. One person could see something as a challenge, and someone could be in the exact same situation and see it as a threat and ignore what they have around them to deal with it. Your appraisal really matters. What I'm going to talk about now is good stress versus bad stress. So this idea came from Hans Selye, who again, we'll talk about him more later. He's big in the stress field. Talking about how Hans Selye's idea was that a little bit of stress is good. It's okay if you have a few stressors in your life. If you have absolutely no stress, your life would be really boring. You'd basically just sit on the couch and do nothing all day long every day. Like, that's kind of not the most awesome life. And, you know, well, this might just be an excuse you use to procrastinate. But if you think, like, I do my best work when I'm under a little bit of a time crunch, that's the idea of a little bit of stress is good for you. So your performance can kind of increase, performance goes up, as your stress level goes up to a point. And when this stress is causing an improved performance, we call that eustress. That is a good kind of stress. It's associated with positive feelings, optimal health, performance, makes you feel good. However, if the stress continues to increase, that's when it moves to the bad type. That's when it moves to distress, which is when stress exceeds that optimal level. It's no longer positive, and that's when it can be excessive, debilitating. It can lead to negative health consequences, all that fun stuff that we're going to be talking about later on. So a little bit of stress is good. Too much stress is bad. When we talk about stress, one person to think about is Walter Cannon. We'll also talk about him in the emotion chapter. He helped create the Cannon-Bard theory of emotions. But Walter Cannon, he was the first person to really identify the body's physiological reaction to stress, that fight or flight response. So your fight or flight response occurs when you experience very strong emotions, especially those that are associated with a perceived threat. Your body says, this could be bad. I've got to be able to prepare. I've got to be able to run fast. I don't need to worry about digesting my food. I've got to just be able to get, you know, air into my lungs, blood to my heart. Let's get going. Cannon viewed this fight or flight response as adaptive because it helps us to adjust internally and externally to changes in our surroundings. It's helpful for the species to survive. If you immediately go into this fight or flight response, back in the day when you saw a lion about to come for you, you were more likely to survive than the person who had to take a while to get going. So it is good. However, there are some downsides to the fight or flight response. For example, if you are repeatedly getting into the fight or flight response, it can wear your body down. It can have a negative impact on you if you are not able to get out of that fight or flight response, get back to that rest and relax part of your system. And we'll be getting into all those negative health consequences that come. One way you see this negative health consequence from the fight or flight response is what Hans Selye created. So Hans Selye, again, I've mentioned him a few times. His name is spelled like this. He was, well, actually, before I get into him, I'm going to show you a video of him talking about his research. So watch this video and then I'll talk about general adaptation syndrome.
Since 1945, Hans Selye has worked here at the University of Montreal as Director of Experimental Medicine and Surgery. The university is now a world center for the study of stress.
The whole concept arose from the observation that in addition to specific diseases, such as a gastric ulcer or typhoid or tuberculosis, there is a syndrome, a set of manifestations, a set of disease signs, which is common to all diseases. For example, that you lose your appetite, you feel ill, you have no energy, you want to lie down rather than get up. And when I was a medical student, I became very interested in this. It didn't seem to me an obvious thing that should exist, that there should exist such a thing as what I called at the time the syndrome of just being sick from anything. And when I published my first paper on it, some 10 years after I first confronted that problem as a medical student, I published it in the British journal Nature under the title A Syndrome Produced by Various Noxious Agents.
What are the diseases of stress?
Well, you know, actually, stress plays a factor, plays a certain role in any disease, because any disease causes an increased demand. You always have to come back to this definition in order to understand it. But there are some diseases in which stress is a decisive factor, and there are a whole lot of diseases that have no apparent cause. And people have been looking for the cause of it for a long time, but there is no cause, because the cause is just any effort. Anything that causes stress.
What is your personal attitude towards stress, towards the stress that's put on you?
Stress is the salt of life. You have to be under stress in order to make life worthwhile. If a person has very much to express and feels that he's very creative, making it impossible for him to exteriorize himself is the most terrible stress that you can put him under. So my philosophy is based on the concept not of being lazy and sitting around and doing nothing and trying to get the shortest working hours, but to work on the stress level for which I was born. Now, some people are more phlegmatic and others have more a need to express themselves. I have a fairly intense need for work. I need it. I couldn't exist without it. But I don't fight for things which I don't win. At least I must be convinced I can win, otherwise I don't fight.
You just give up?
I just give up. I admit defeat and do something else.
So for Hans Selye, a little bit of stress is good. Too much stress is bad. Too much stress can wear you down. He discovered this when he was doing research with rats, and he was injecting some with hormones to see what happened, and then he had his control group who he was injecting with saline, and he realized that even those rats were having a stress response, because you know it's stressful if you're a lab rat getting injected with things, even if it's just saline, and that the rats were showing health consequences because of their participation in his study. They had ulcers in their stomachs, their adrenal glands were enlarged, their lymph nodes were smaller than they should be, lots of bad stuff. And that made him realize that this was a physiological reaction to stress, and that the physiological reaction you have to stress is non-specific. It means whether that stress is because you have a test the next day, or because your cousin is in jail, or because you got in a car accident. No matter what is the stressor, your body physiologically has the same response to that, the same pattern of reactions. And this led him to create his general adaptation syndrome. The general adaptation syndrome is your body's non-specific physiological response. There's 3 stages. You have alarm, reaction, resistance, and exhaustion. So we'll go through these. Alarm reaction is your immediate reaction when that stressor pops up, when that bad things happens. So this is that, basically it's the fight or flight response. It's that cortisol being released, it's your blood pumping harder, all that fun stuff. If after that initial shock of the alarm reaction has worn off, but the stressor has not gone away, like you're still dealing with insurance about the car accident, cousin's not getting out of jail anytime soon, then you move into this resistance stage. Your body remains alert. It's prepared to respond like in the alarm reaction, but just with a little less intensity than that immediate fight or flight response. If you keep stressed, you keep the stressor in your life, it's not going away, eventually your body's going to wear out. That's when you get to exhaustion. You're not able to adapt to that stressor anymore. Your physiological reserves are depleted, and this is when the stressor is going to start having a negative physiological effect on you. You are going to be more prone to, we'll talk about this later, lots of illnesses, cancer, heart attacks, lots of good stuff, because your body just can't respond anymore. So you have that initial jolt, then your body kind of readjusts, and then later on that depletion in your resources if the stressor doesn't go away. So that is the general adaptation syndrome. The next thing to talk about is different types of stressors. You can have chronic stressors. Chronic stressors are events that persist over an extended period of time. This is something like if your grandpa is diagnosed with Alzheimer's and he's going to have it for 15 years. This is if you have, I don't know, an hour-long commute to get to your job and you're not going to change your job anytime soon. It's going to stick around. So those are chronic. Acute stressors are brief focal points that sometimes continue to be experienced as overwhelming well after the event happens. This is a tornado. This is a car accident. This is something bad that even after that immediate stressor is gone might impact you in some way later on. One thing that acute stressors can lead to is trauma. Traumatic events would be acute stressors. So when you experience a traumatic event, sometimes people will develop PTSD from this. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a chronic stress reaction characterized by experiences and behaviors that may include several symptoms. These symptoms involve intrusive and painful memories of the stressful event, jumpiness, persistent negative emotional states, detachment from others, or angry outbursts. You avoid things that remind you of the event. For example, when I was in grad school, my townhouse burned down. I lived there with a roommate. just totally gutted the whole thing. Fire, gone. And I was not there when it happened. That would be a traumatic event, by the way. Lose everything when you're 23 and you don't have renter's insurance. Make sure you have renter's insurance. So I was not there when the fire happened, but my roommate was. My roommate saw our house go up in flames, had to run out. So she developed PTSD from being there when our house burned down. And so, for example, she couldn't, in our new place we got, a professor let us live in his house when he was on sabbatical. It had a gas stove. She couldn't use the kitchen for a while because she couldn't look at the flame on the gas stove. That was a reminder of what happened. Hearing I did not have PTSD from this. It was traumatic, but I did not develop PTSD. But like smelling smoke, even if it was just like a bonfire or someone grilling, caused her to be, and me for a while, to get scared. Like, where's the fire? What's going on? Or hearing fire trucks, nightmares, lots of fun stuff. That's PTSD. You cannot develop PTSD, or you can't be diagnosed with it until a month after a traumatic event. If you have a little bit of trauma immediately after something traumatic, that makes sense. That's not PTSD. PTSD is if you're still showing those same trauma signs more than a month after the traumatic event happened. So, question for you, who is most susceptible to developing PTSD? So again, I don't know if you got those right or wrong at this point, but men are experience more traumatic events, but women are more prone to develop PTSD after something traumatic happens. Overall, so that's a gender difference based on who's more likely to get it. Overall, you see more people who are lower income who have PTSD, but that's because they go through significantly more traumatic events. Life is just harder if you don't have a lot of money to help. And then people who are not white, people of color, are more likely to go through traumatic events with all the lovely structural violence we have in our country. And so they have higher rates of PTSD. They are not necessarily more prone to getting PTSD compared to someone who is white who goes through the exact same thing. But the more often something traumatic happens, the more likely it is eventually you will develop PTSD. So that's trauma. Next level of stressors is life changes. These are a little more chill. Life changes are events or situations that require you to make changes in your ongoing life. They require time to adjust to these changes. One way we measure these is through the SRRS, the Social Readjustment Rating Scale by Holmes and Rahe. And this is on the original SRRS. There's 43 life events that require varying levels of personal adjustment. And each one of these has what is called a life change unit, a number for its life change unit. So basically 100 is this is going to have to make you change your life the most, down to, oh gosh, the lowest on it. Okay, so I looked it up. Number 100 is death of a spouse. The lowest out of their 43 is minor violation of the law, and that's 11 life change units. That would be like getting a speeding ticket. So it's how much is this going to affect you? And so you go through these list of 43 things. If this thing has happened to you in the last 12 months, you get the points. You add up all the points you got, and then based on that, it tells you the chance you have of suffering from stress to the point that it gives you an illness or an accident in the near future. So if your score is between, or if your score is over 300, you have a 30% chance of having a stress-related illness in the near future. If it's between 150 and 299, you have a 50% chance. And if it's less than 150, 30% chance. So that is the SRS. Now, I'm not going to show you that actual one because I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the top three of that one, by the way, death of a spouse, divorce, and marital separation, I'm going to say none of y'all have had any of those things happen in the last 12 months. And so there is a different one that was created called the Student SRRS. And that is a better one for you to take. It's things like, failing a class, having to drop a class, having trouble with your roommate, things that are more likely to actually be a part of your life as students. So that's the SRRS. Now, there's a couple of criticisms of the SRRS. One is that it's vague, like minor violations of the law. Different people might take that differently. Another problem with it is that some of the things on it are positive. It's like vacation, celebrating Christmas or a Hanukkah. Hopefully Christmas or Hanukkah wasn't horrible for you, but it doesn't distinguish really between major life events that are positive versus major life events that are negative. But in actuality, if something really negative happens, there's going to be a negative emotional component to that that's not going to be there if it's something positive like a vacation. The final complaint with the SRRS is that it doesn't take appraisal into account. Because remember, two people can go through the same thing and it can be seen very differently. It can affect them physiologically very differently because of their differences in their stress response to it. For example, like moving is on there. It doesn't cause me as much stress as other people. That's just life. But that's the SRS. Final category for stressors is hassles. Hassles are the minor irritations and annoyances that are part of everyday life. Researchers have shown that the frequency of daily hassles, and again, your perception on their severity, is actually a better predictor of physical and psychological health rather than the SRRS, rather than those life change units. So your everyday life matters more on your immediate physical health. Do you have back pain? Do you have a cold? That sort of things. And there's lots of things that can cause your daily hassles. A big one for y'all is social media. So in one experiment that was done, undergrads who over a 10-week period reported greater Facebook-induced stress had higher rates of upper respiratory infections than the students who didn't report being stressed because of social media. This was especially true if they had large social networks. So stress in your everyday life, those normal everyday things of stress really matter. The final thing I'm going to go over in this video is stress and jobs. For this, one thing to know is job strain. Job strain is a work situation that combines excessive job demands and workload with little discretion in decision making or job control. So you have a lot to do and you don't get a lot of say over what you do. People are more susceptible to job strain. They're more likely to have job strain if they have low status jobs. I mean, you don't get to make decisions. And if you have job strain, it is associated with a lot of negative things. It's associated with hypertension, heart attacks, weight loss or weight gain, and major depressive disorder, which is a mood disorder you will learn about in chapter 15. Something that job strain can lead to is job burnout. This is a general sense of emotional exhaustion and cynicism in relation to one's job. There are 3 dimensions to job burnout. One, you have exhaustion. So you just feel like your emotional resources are drained, that you're at the end of the rope, you have nothing more to give. You have depersonalization, which is a sense of emotional detachment between the worker and the recipients of their service. So the person can kind of come off as callous, cynical, indifferent, that sort of thing. Think about like if you go to the DMV and the person behind the counter just doesn't care about you. Depersonalization. And then the third dimension is diminished personal accomplishment. You evaluate your work negatively. You don't think your job really means anything. So again, job strain is one of the main factors that leads to job burnout. There are certain people who are more susceptible to burnout. They are people who are older. So people who are between 55 and 64, kind of right before retirement. If they're unmarried, if they do manual labor jobs, if they drink a lot of alcohol, if they're not physically active, if they're overweight, and if they have physical disorders or psychological disorders. Those are all factors that can contribute to it. And that is where I will stop for this video. In the next video, we will talk about stress and illness.